video is sponsored by TrueFire. Over 2 million guitar players worldwide improve their playing using TrueFire's online lesson systems. Learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5 Watt World, where we're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. There's an exercise in sociology where you try to recall your earliest memory in a particular subject. The idea behind this is that our earliest experiences may form the foundation of our interpretation of related experiences that come later. An example of this is my good friend Jeff McErlane, whose first song memory is Stairway to Heaven. Maybe that explains why the electric guitar sound in his head is still pretty martially. Our editor's first guitar memory is Revolution by the Beatles, and if you ask me, that blown-out overdrive coming from a guitar direct into a Neve console might even explain his confusing tolerance, love even, of the violent, discordant, and frankly sometimes suspect music he's always sending me. So if you all think your way back, what's your first memory of an electric guitar sound? I'll go first. It's 1966. My brother and I would have been in the first and second grade. As I've mentioned before, my father was a high school art teacher in the same town where I grew up and went to elementary school, and on occasion he'd get to drive us home. Back then, my dad drove a gray 1958 Ford Ranchero, which already had some serious miles on it. We'd sit 3 abreast on the bench seat, and all of us would be within reach of the radio. On rare occasions, my father would let us push the buttons on the radio, and we'd watch in amazement as the AM dial would mechanically skip from one preset station to another. It was on one of these rare occasions that I was the one to push the button, and out of the speakers came the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand. I still vividly remember the smell of that old Ford, and as I remember the jangling guitars as well, they sank into my memory. Today, I know that the sound of that electric guitar was also the sound of a Vox AC30. Working on the script, I realized that if you were 5 years old in, say, 1975, that first song you remember might have been Somebody to Love by Queen, Brian May's legions of AC30s set to stun. If you were 5 years old in 1985, it could well have been Don't Come Around Here No More by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, more AC30s. In 1995, it might have been Radiohead's Creep, and in 2005, probably Brad Paisley's Mud on the Tires, yet more AC30s. And if you were 5 in 2015, stop watching this video, kid, and go play outside. So if you want to know the story of the amp that can fill over 60 years worth of first guitar memories, stick around, because this is the 5 Watt World short history of the Vox AC30. If you enjoy our videos, take a minute to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when we put out new videos. And if you've already subscribed, swing by the store and grab a t-shirt or a mug to support what we're doing here. And if you don't need another t-shirt, consider becoming a friend of 5 Watt. The links are in the description. The Jennings Organ Company was founded by Tom Jennings in 1951. They'd been selling portable organs, but in 1957, they decided to move into amplifiers, naming the company JMI to be part of the guitar boom happening at the time. Jennings hired Dick Denny as a second engineer, along with Derek Underdown, who'd been with Jennings for many years already, and pointed Denny at designing an amplifier to satisfy the demand for a British-built product. Remember that between 1951 and 59, there'd been a ban on imports of musical instruments from the United States, so the market was hungry for a locally built amp for the skiffle, jazz, and dance band scene, along with that new rock and roll sound. Earlier amps had used both direct current and alternating current, and that had exposed musicians to potentially deadly levels of voltage. Always looking ahead to marketing, Jennings decided to emphasize that their designs would be AC only, going out of their way to make this clear by naming the amp line AC, under the assumption that our amps won't get you killed was a desirable feature. The first amp specifically marketed for guitar was the AC2/30. But like most amps at the time, it was also for microphones, accordions, and even phonographs. It was introduced late in 1957 as a hi-fi amplifier. Clean power and high fidelity were still design objectives at this point in popular music. Designed alongside the AC1/15, which would be renamed the AC15, the AC2/30 actually made it to the marketplace a couple of months ahead of the AC15. There are a variety of stories about how the AC2/30 came about, but all agree that this was the first amp that Dick Denny worked on. Interestingly, Denny has said that the AC2/30 was a bit of a side project, something to fill out the line while the AC15 was being readied for the marketplace. Heavily based on the EL34-based organ amplifiers at Jennings Organ, its preamp was modified slightly by Denny to make it better suited for guitar. It also shared the 12-inch Goodman's Audiom 60 speaker with the organ amplifiers. There wasn't a conscious decision to use EL34s over the EL84s being used in the AC15. It was simply that the organ amps on which it was based had used EL34 power tubes. When I read this, I was frankly a bit shocked, as I've always read or heard in multiple places that the first AC30s were EL34 based amps, but were changed to EL84s because the 34s, quote, didn't fit in the chassis. Like many legends, this wasn't entirely apocryphal, but this first 30-watter at Vox was always an EL34 amp, and they fit just fine. Despite advertising and some being played out on gigs, by the end of March 1958, Vox had stopped advertising the amp, and due to lack of demand, it's never really went into production. It's likely that only a handful ever were built. In the meantime, the AC15 had been launched and was widely embraced in the UK market. Instead of a generic amplification of the signal, Denny had worked on the circuit to capture an idealized version of the frequencies a guitar is capable of producing. Denny used a Mullard phase inverter style, what has now become known as a long-tailed pair. It also used an EF86 pentode preamp tube in the normal channel, an EZ81 rectifier tube, and a tremolo vibrato circuit, all in the one amp. There was nothing else like it at the time. Despite the success of the AC15, by 1959, guitar players were asking for an amp with more power. The famous stories of Cliff Richard and the Shadows gigs, where girls screaming in the front row drowning out the band, appear to be absolutely true. The size of the crowds were sending bands into larger venues as well, further increasing the need for more power. Derek Underdown remembers, Tom Jennings resisted for a time, as he always liked to be the one that came up with the ideas for new products. Jennings also believed that a 30-watt amp would be too loud and too heavy to really appeal in the marketplace. Notorious to this day for its weight and unrelenting volume, AC30s have been measured at over 124 decibels at full tilt. Underwood and Denny, in particular as a player, continued to lobby Tom for the 30-watter. And as we know now, Jennings eventually relented and had Denny get to work on the amp. As Jennings believed the AC15 was the largest amp any guitarist should be forced to carry, he decreed that the new amp would have to fit in the same size cabinet and have to use the same 12-inch speaker. Of course, this meant that no new tooling or setup for a new cabinet would be added to the cost of the new amp as well. In the end, they also shared the same control panel and knobs, again saving on costs. The resulting amps were affectionately known to the JMI staff as squares. The 15 and 30 appeared identical, except for a small badge in the bottom left corner of the grille. In the earliest days of 1960, there was quite a bit of variation from amp to amp. Control panels were either black or later white. Different Rexine coverings were used, the diamond cream, an alligator print, and a medium gray. The Vox logos were at first individual letters, and only later, as money became available, was the plastic logo cast as a single piece. As they were using the same cabinet as the 15-watter, space had to be found to accommodate the additional parts of the 30. The solution was to break the chassis into two parts, the preamp section and the power tubes mounted above, and the transformer and rectifier tube in another chassis on the bottom. By 1960, the 76th AC30 was being produced, and it had finally achieved a standardized, purpose-built chassis, which was then outsourced. That single-speaker AC30 was introduced between March and May of 1959. It was priced in the April 30th, 1959 Melody Maker magazine at 79 guineas. At the start, the 30 also had the EF86 preamp tube of the AC15, but this fell out of favor as it was prone to becoming microphonic when subjected to the constant and substantial vibrations in the combos. The earliest amps also had a cut control, which, like the 15, could be used to tame the high frequency of the output stage. In 1960, Vox changed the normal channel away from the EF86 in favor of an ECC83, or as we say in the States, a 12AX7. It was late in 1959 that Vox decided that they would finally produce a 30-watt twin-speaker amp. Of course, the twin was designed to take over where the square left off, and in the end, approximately 100 of the square AC30-style amps were produced. By that point, the ban against importing instruments from the US had expired, and Fender twins were beginning to be imported, so the shops in London began asking Jennings for a Vox to compete. Jennings relented, but insisted that the amp had to be no taller than the existing single-speaker models. To accommodate production, the amp moved to a rear-loading chassis, diverging from the organ and square amps. By late '59, Denny had worked up a design that was based on the EL34-based amp, and this is where we get to the EL34s being too big for the chassis. The amp would need to be 2 inches taller to fit into the chassis in the cabinet with the 34s. But Jennings was firm that the new amp could only be the original 27.5 inches tall. Undeterred, Denny used the knowledge he'd gained as an engineer in the Royal Air Force using tubes in a parallel push-pull configuration, a relatively new idea for guitar amps, but one seen in the output stage of some Hammond and Wurlitzer organs of the day. As a result, the new chassis could make the 30-watt goal and fit in the height requirement, and AC30s began to be built with EL84s. Banking on the name Twin, already in use by Fender, Vox followed suit and named the new design the AC30 Twin. This naming would be carried on later to the AC10 Twin, the AC15 Twin, and the AC50 Twin. The first twin amp is also referred to as the AC30/4, indicating the number of inputs in the amp. In addition to meeting the power goals, the parallel push-pull was more reliable. Underwood recalled, if one EL84 went down, you only lost 3% of the sound. The new twins were wider versions of the familiar TV front squares in cream with diamond Rexine covering and the brown diamond grill cloth. But there was some experimenting with different colors as they became available. Despite the fact that the AC30/4 was slated to be produced, Denny had always imagined that the amp would have 2 inputs for each of its normal, vibrato, and brilliant channels. The team had the chassis drilled for 6 inputs, such that the single chassis could be used for both the AC30/4 and the AC30/6. The AC30/6 was first advertised in the November 1960 issue of Melody Maker. The same issue, the 4-input model was introduced in. By March of 1961, the AC30/4 was priced at 95 guineas, and the AC30/6 was 105 guineas. By September of 1961, the AC30/4 input model would be discontinued, and a base model AC30/6 was introduced. The base model was offered at 105 guineas, and interestingly, the guitar model's price was reduced at that point down to 100 guineas. And now we come to the amp that most any modern player would think of when you say AC30. In the fall of 1960, the AC30 Twin was given the new split front styling and was covered in fawn Rexine along with all the other amps in the model line at Vox. There were 3 leather handles along the top and 3 brass vent louvers to allow the tubes to breathe. When they'd been first introduced in 1960, the Twins had the same speakers of the original squares, the 12-inch Rolla G12. But that year, the JMI engineers worked with Celestion to redesign the speaker to meet the needs of the new 30-watt amplifier, and work was completed by August. Though originally offered with an exposed magnet and painted oyster hammer, a pinkish gray, by January of 1961, a bell cover had been added, and the color was changed to a dark azure blue. Thus was the birth of the Celestian Blue. These speakers would be used in the AC30 Twins and Super Twins until the end of the JMI era at Vox. Vox sales manager at the time, Reg Clark, quoted Dick Denny as having said, "Once in a while you'll get an amplifier giving an output that matches perfectly with the speakers, and when that happens, it'll sound twice as loud as the wattage that this amplifier is giving out." I don't know about the physics of that, and I'm certainly no engineer, but I do know that an AC30 with a head of steam is a seriously loud amplifier. But many will tell you that the AC30 reached its final form when Denny added the top boost tone circuit. Going to 1961, bands were asking for more, quote, screaming top, end quote, to cut through the sound of the crowds. Essentially, this is his adaptation of the cathode follower tone stack used on the Fender Tweed basements, minus the middle control. Modified for use in the AC30, it first became available in 1961 as a mod done at the factory or shipped separately to the retailer and installed there. This mod included adding an extra preamp tube and mounting the top boost treble and bass controls on a plate on the back of the panel of the amp. By 1964, the top boost model came direct from the factory as an option, with all the knobs mounted right on the top of the control panel. In either configuration, the top boost EQ adds the extra sparkle and high-end content that the bands of the day were looking for to have the guitars cut through the din of the band and the crowd. There continued to be small part tweaks to the amplifiers into the mid-60s. The changes are small enough that I don't have room here for all the details in this short history. If you yearn for that level of detail in the small hours of the morning, I highly recommend investing a copy of Jim Elyea's amazing Vox Amplifiers, The JMI Years. The Vox AC Super Twin amps referred to separate head and speaker cabinet units. First promoted in the October Melody Maker, Vox 30-watt Super Twin Deluxe for 125 guineas, 25 guineas more than the combo. The speaker cabinets were sealed, and this boosted the bass response, but the success of these units was limited. In 1964, Mick Bennett, head of JMI Custom Shop, came up with an idea for the head of the Super Twins with short sides slanting up into the middle towards the control panel. For whatever reason, these didn't catch on in the UK, but were more popular in the US. Also in '64, the AC30 expanded frequency model with two 15-inch speakers was introduced using the top boost chassis. And with that, the amp's design stabilized until the end of the JMI years in 1967. In the end, fully half of the amps produced of Vox amplifiers were AC30 twins. It's never been out of production, and in one form or another remains the flagship of the Korg-made present-day Vox line. Hank Marvin and the Shadows moved from their AC15 to the AC30s early on, and this might have encouraged a young band from Liverpool to acquire a pair of Fawn AC30s in 1962. The Beatles would prove to be Vox's top ambassadors, helping to take the brand to an international audience. Of course, the success, and hence the size and volume of the audiences coming to see the Beatles, soon outstripped the capabilities of even these 30-watt amps, and most of the increases in amp wattage at Vox at the time can be directly traced to their performing needs. The AC50 for John Lennon and George Harrison, and the AC100 for Paul McCartney's bass are two prime examples. These amps would become available in the public by 1964. And though the AC50 and 100 are collectible, mainly due to their use by the Beatles, they've never been as desirable as the 30 or the 15. Other AC30 users in the 60s included Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck and the Yardbirds. Brian Jones and Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones were early AC30 users. Ritchie Blackmore has said that the AC30 has always been his favorite amp, and it featured prominently on the first three Deep Purple records. Justin Hayward of the Moody Blues, and Dave Davies of the Kinks. Sadly, the rapid success of Vox and parent company JMI in the early 60s led to their eventual downfall. Trying to grow rapidly to capitalize on the demand generated by the Beatles, Jennings sought out investors, eventually selling a major portion of the company to the Royston Group near the end of 1964. Royston then struck a deal to license the Vox name to the Thomas Organ Company in California, with the idea being to build more of their tube amps there to meet the growing international demand. But once they had the name, Thomas Organ began manufacturing inferior solid-state amps and branding them as Vox, selling them to American guitarists, hoping to get a piece of the Beatles' magic with creatively expanded margins. Though not foreseen in the original deal, it turned out to be perfectly legal and particularly tragic for the brand's image in the U.S. While they were still manufacturing the original Amazing amps in Britain, players in the U.S. were being sold amps with British-style names like Westminster, Royal Guardsman, and Cambridge that made thin and distinctly non-Beatles-like noises. To further confuse things, these solid-state amps were often marketed with a picture of the Beatles playing UK-made Vox amps in the background. Having signed away his rights to control his company, Tom Jennings was let go by Royston in 1967. Dick Denny had already left the company by that time, so together they formed Jennings Electric Industries, JEI, in 1968. In Vox's original Dartford location, where they manufactured an early synthesizer, some effects pedals, and a tube guitar amp, the AC40, featuring a familiar 4EL84 tube power section. After a short run, JEI closed up shop in 1973. The drop in reputation after the Thomas Organ deal led to a name change to Vox Sound Equipment Limited by 1968. Though the introduction of solid-state amps had a lot to do with the downfall of the company, it's also true that the higher wattage tube amps championed by Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, and Pete Townsend were boosting fellow Brit companies Marshall and Hiwatt, eclipsing the sound of the 30-watt combos. Due to unrelated circumstances, Royston filed for bankruptcy in 1969, and a company named Corinthian Securities held the assets of VSL while it went through the courts. Vox basically tried to coast during this time until it was purchased by Birch Stolek Industries in 1970. Keeping the VSL name, and they moved the manufacturing from Royston's location in Erith, Kent, to Hastings, Essex. Birch Stolek owned Lemark Transformers and had been a major creditor of Vox's from the Royston bankruptcy case. The name was then shortened to Vox Sound Limited, and they revised the all-tube AC30 adding reverb and moved to a printed circuit board, giving up the hand-wired tag strip construction of the JMI-era amps. The AC-15 was dropped the same year. Irish bluesman Rory Gallagher was using a Strat into a cooking AC-30 in the 70s. And then, of course, Brian May, one of the best-known users, was scoring hit after hit with Queen. Paul Weller of The Jam used AC-30s. Andrew Latimer of the prog band Camel. And also Joe Strummer of The Clash were all known as AC-30 guys. By 73, Vox was sold to Dallas Musical Instruments, who had built the Sound City amplifier line prior to purchasing Vox. Tom Jennings was brought in as a consultant and worked for them until his death in 1978. Dallas replaced the printed circuit board AC-30 amps introduced by Birch Stolek with hand-wired models like the original JMI designs. These hand-wired AC-30s were produced from 73 to 76. They then reverted to PCB boards, and the AC30s were produced in this format from 76 to 78, manufactured in the Shrewsbury facility. The amps were a pale imitation of those that had come before. In 78, Dallas sold Vox to Rose Morris. RM was the distributor of Marshall amplification in Europe, and throughout the 70s they were concerned that they might lose their distribution deal with Marshall, so they bought Vox to diversify their holdings. The name of the company was shortened from VSL to Vox Limited. RM continued to build on the Vox Sound/CBS Arbiter formula. These were volatile times at Vox amps, and as RM issued a variety of AC30 types, and the amps from the early 60s became more and more desirable. Finally, in 1990, Rose Morris decided to do a limited edition of 1,000 old and improved spec combos, along with a piggyback rig in 1991. Though short-lived, it created hope among the faithful. Interestingly, Paul McCartney still tours with Vox Vintage Series AC30 amps produced by Rose Morris at around that time. In the 80s, Bryan Adams and Keith Scott repopularized the sound of the 30 with many guitar-driven hits. The early U2 records are covered with the Edge playing a 30. Beatles worshippers Mike Campbell and Tom Petty with the Heartbreakers used AC30s to invoke those fabled tones, and Peter Buck from REM embraced the jangle with his Ricks and AC30s as well. A recession hit, and Rose Morris sold the Vox name to a new management group under Korg in late 1992. Built for Korg by Marshall in the UK under the direction of Steve Grindrod at Marshall, who would later become managing director at Vox. Korg continued improvements first indicated by the return to a GZ34 tube rectifier, and then adding the newly reissued Celestian Blue speakers. In 1996, Korg brought back the AC15 after a 26-year absence. Under Korg's oversight, the AC30 TBX was released and is considered to be the best standard production AC30 since the JMI years. In the 90s and 2000s, Noel Gallagher of Oasis used AC30s. Jazzman John Scofield began using AC30s as well. John Jorgensen of the Desert Rose Band, and later the Hellcasters, and in a direct AC30 line from Jorgensen, and my reason for being fascinated by the sound of a Telecaster into a Vox amp was country guitarist Brad Paisley. So it was in the early 1990s that quality and innovation came back to Vox in the hands of Korg. At the end of 2003, the TBX amps were discontinued, and Vox moved the AC30 Custom Classic production to China. But in January 2010, they began producing the new AC Custom series, moving production of the AC4, 15, and 30 Custom to a new and larger facility in China, where they continue to be built to the present day. Also in 2003, Korg had begun building their Valvetronics series amps in Vietnam. And in 2010, they used that factory to build the new AC hand-wired amps. Most recently, in 2015, Vox moved the hand-wired amp production to the dedicated Korg factory in Vietnam. With the exception of the 60th anniversary amps, which were built by hand in the UK, all of the hand-wired range continues to be built in Vietnam to this day. And that brings us up to date. I've partnered with TrueFire because I've used them for over a decade, and my playing always improves when I put in the time on their lessons. Whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or professional player, TrueFire has lessons to inspire and advance your playing. As you know, I always promote spending money on lessons before new gear. I really like TrueFire, and I think if you give them a shot, I think you'll like them too. Get 25% off courses using the promo code 5watt25. Or like I have for many years, sign up for the All Access Pass to use the entire TrueFire catalog. I'm currently working my way through Jeff McErlane's Uptown Blues course. You can sample anything in the catalog with the All Access Pass and see where the muse takes you. I love their tagline, learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. I'd like to thank TrueFire for partnering with me and sponsoring this video. I hope you've enjoyed this trip through the history of the AC30. This one is dear to me and got some extra attention. In producing this one, I enjoyed every minute of the required reading, listening, and playing. I even busted out my own dual AC10 wet-dry rig to stay in the mood. I altered that with the AC30 presets in my Stomp preset pack and was guilty of turning both up a little more than I should have. Take a minute to comment and add the artists that you feel I skipped over that were important to the history of the AC30. And if you're so inclined to share it, what's your earliest memory of an electric guitar sound and whether you think that stuck with you as a player? This video would not have been possible without Jim Elyea's massive and amazing Vox Amplifiers, the JMI years, and Dave Hunter's The British Amp Invasion. There are Amazon affiliate links for the books in the description, and if you buy one from there, I get a percentage, so that helps keep the channel going. I need to thank Nick Orchard, creator and keeper of VoxAC30.org.uk. This video would have been thinner and less satisfying without his extraordinary website. I need to thank Brian Piccolo at Korg Vox US and Ian Doggett at Vox UK for answering my questions about the production of Vox amps since moving to Korg. I reached out and they pulled together information I hadn't been able to find anywhere else. I need to thank Holger Notzel from Comet Amps for talking to me about the AC30 lineage and how it relates to train wrecks, and for going over the script for me. I need to thank Dave Honorato for adding the details that few seem to know. And I need to thank Perry McManus for helping out with another very long short history script. I need to thank my new friend and fellow YouTuber John Cordy for playing the intro and outro on a borrowed 1970 AC30. If you're not following John's YouTube channel already, I'm sure the playing here will convince you that you need to be. I need to thank all of you that have stopped by the store and grabbed a hoodie, t-shirt, or the HX Stomp preset pack. And finally, I need particularly thank the Friends of 5 Watt for their continued support of everything we do here at 5 Watt World. You guys are the best. The links for the store and the club are in the description. Thanks for watching. Until next time, thanks for being a part of the 5 Watt World.